So thank you all so much for being in this conversation. I know we could probably chat for 3 days straight and still have more that we could dig into. But I want to turn it over, Ajamu, to you to lead us in safety and security. Yes. Um, so folks can get a little bit of skill building tonight as well.
Absolutely. So I know we have about 30 minutes. I won't take that long, but just really like what this is about, you all. What I'm going to do is just share with you. I've done this in probably 3 different countries and probably about 25 cities, right? So it's just really some best practices for collective security. And I say that because a lot of people are under the what I would call erroneous assumption that security is a personal thing. It's a thing for me and my family. And I don't think that for activists that we can afford to see it like that. Like the problems that cause the danger are not individual, they're collective, they're state sponsored, they're state supportive, vigilante sponsored. So all of these things are collective apparatuses. So the safety that we have, the only safety we have is a collective response, right? So these are best practices designed to facilitate that. So the first part of that is, again, like I said, the forces of oppression are organized. And so we have to recognize that. We have to have a higher level of organization in everything that we do if we really want to try to mitigate the dangers that we face, right? And that means our solution has to be collective, as I said. And a security plan is essential. And that plan needs to be in existence in our organizations, in our households, in every element of life that we engage in. We need to have this security plan. And what are the necessary components of a security plan? And they are, collective efforts, obviously, to look out for each other, right? That should hopefully go without saying. Developing a check-in procedure, having a procedure where people have the ability to check in. This process I learned from the movement elders from the 60s, from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And if you don't know about SNCC's work, you really should, because a lot of what we are able to do today is because of their sacrifices. But one of the things that they definitely had was a strong check-in procedure because of the danger they faced organizing in Mississippi and Alabama in the 1960s. And so, for example, when Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, the three civil rights workers who were SNCC and core workers, were murdered in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964, the SNCC people knew. I mean, this is what they've told me. They knew immediately that those three young men were dead. They knew minutes after the check-in time that they were dead because they didn't check in. And because the danger was so prevalent, you just didn't just blow off the check-in time. You knew that if you didn't check in at a payphone, that's all they had back in that day, to call in, that people would assume you were dead. That was the mindset of all of the organizers. So that might seem dramatic to you. I don't think it's dramatic at all. I think that we have to have that some sort of check-in process like that, where we can figure out, and it can be a number of things. You can utilize applications like Signal, if that's your thing. You can have other methods. You can have meetup points, whatever you decide to do, whatever makes sense for where you are and what your terrain looks like. You got to have that in place. And then there has to be training on how to respond collectively to a crisis, right? Like, we live in a society where mass shootings happen all the time. But how many of us have a strategy in place for how to react when they happen? And there are ways to do that. There are ways to mitigate danger when that happens if everybody knows what to do. But what happens typically when somebody pulls out a gun and starts shooting is everybody just panics. And panic is the primary recipe for disaster in every scenario. So we can definitely help people train. This is part of what I do on a regular basis, how to respond to this so that everybody knows. If there's 20 of you, all 20 of you know what your role is, right? That's essential. And, this is something you can decide whether you want to do. I'm a strong proponent of strike teams. And what strike teams are you have a group of people who are dedicated, disciplined, and trustworthy, who their sole function is to respond physically to any threats that occur. And I know some of you will say, well, that's what the police are for. Well, that might be how you see it, but a lot of us don't see it like that. So for those of us that don't see it, I know certainly most people that look like me don't see it like that. And a lot of other people, a lot of LGBTQ folks, trans folks, they don't see it like that either. So if you're organizing within circles with folks like that, Indigenous, Latino, they don't see that. So if you're organizing in those circles, it's helpful to have a team of people who are prepared to not to harm anybody, but are trained and prepared to step in and mitigate danger when a bad actor gets physical, right? And those are things, again, that people can be trained on. That's something that can do. I spend a lot of time doing this. Having your own security language that nobody outside of your elements understands, so that you can communicate clearly when there's danger. Like I remember when we were talking about it for the ROP office in Cottage Grove some years ago, we came up, it was a brilliant suggestion to use the name of ROP's founder over the PA system. Obviously, she's not here anymore with us in her physical form, but once people heard her name, they knew it was time to leave. There was something happening that we needed to react to. So something like that nobody else is going to have any clue what's being said. And identifying locations, right? Like, where does everybody meet up at in case there's something wrong that happens, right? Where does everybody go? Having that in place. Right. And then the resources, you have to figure out what type of equipment you need to do all of these things, what type of resources you need to do all these things. And again, these are things that you can get help from in terms of how to do that. And you have to practice. You have to have scenario and you have to practice everybody's role in the scenario. Otherwise, you're not going to do it when it happens in the moment. I don't care how much you think you're going to do it. I'm telling you from experience, you're not going to do it. The adrenaline is going to get a hold of you. The fear is going to get hold of you. That's why you practice. Anything you do that you practice, you train your muscle memory in your brain to perform certain functions. That's the purpose of that. So if you practice these steps, your training will kick in when you need it the most. Very, very important. That cannot be overstated because most people don't practice. They just think they're going to know what to do. And sadly, most of the time they don't. So looking at these areas, the last thing that I'll go over is just each of these things I mentioned, just kind of getting into a little more detail. Developing mechanisms to get in touch quickly. There are a lot of things, GroupMe, WhatsApp, buddy systems. I mentioned Signal, selling text loops, phone trees. You can decide any way you can do it. You can decide processes if the phones go down for some reason. You're in a small area. Whose job is it to jump in their car and drive to the next person's house, and then you go to the next person's house? Whatever you have to do, a process that everybody understands. This is how we check in with each other, right? And establish protocols and triggers for this. In other words, what is it that needs to happen to trigger this activity where we're checking in with everyone? It can't just be like someone standing outside of a building yelling. That would be, if you have that, then after 2 or 3 times of that, nobody's going to respond. And then when you really need people to respond, they're not going to, because they're like, yeah, that's nothing again. So you got to establish clear, legitimate protocols and triggers for what triggers this action to happen, right? And only you can do that. Like, we can certainly help you do that for sure, but it's going to be based on what your circumstances are where you are. And mention the language, very important. Establishing that, I'm not saying you have to develop an entirely new language, but one of the things that we used when we had the tour, the Mile Here tour, almost 10 years ago, in Oregon, when I was living up there, is we had our strike team, our security team, and our code word for somebody was really acting out was Batui Wawa, which is, I speak Tree. I've lived in Ghana. Ghana's my favorite place on the planet Earth. And Batuiwawa means crazy white people in Tree. So we knew, everybody knew, all of us of all nationalities who were on that team, if somebody said Batuiwawa, that was, we knew where we needed to go and we knew we needed to be ready to engage. Something as simple as that. That's all it took. So you have to establish something like that. Ensure, and then you got to make sure everybody's trained in how to use your processes. Like, and that comes from the practice, of course. You've got to practice scenarios, active shooter scenarios, disruptive scenarios, conflict de-escalation needed scenarios, somebody charging the stage at an event scenarios. What are people going to do? Who's going to do what, right? If everybody charges after the person charging the stage, what if that's a distraction of something far worse that's supposed to happen? That's how Malcolm X got assassinated. Some guys stood up in the audience and were acting like one was picking the other's pocket, and everybody looked at that, and the people who were there to shoot him stood up and approached the stage and shot him. So you got to have people understanding their role when something happens. That's why that's so important. So if somebody charges the stage, I know my job is to run and stop them from reaching the podium. Your job on the other side of the room is to hold your post and watch everything going on around you. Like everybody has, from practice, you figure that out, right? And then responses, where are your safe houses if you want to have that? Where are the places where everybody goes that nobody knows about? And be creative with this. Like a safe house could be a McDonald's. It doesn't have to be, an underground bunker that locks from the biometric. It doesn't have to be all that. It just has to be somewhere where everybody could go, where there's people there. It mitigates danger, right? So figure out in your area what your safe houses are and make sure everybody knows where they are and has a clear route how to get there. Knows exactly how to get there, what it takes, how much time it takes, all of that. So you can have this process in place to make sure you confirm everyone's whereabouts, right? And establish your process for when people are in peril. Like, who does what? Who acts? What is the act? Like, you meet somewhere, there's 4 of you. 3 of you show up, the 4th person doesn't show up. They're not answering their phone. What roles do all 3 of you have at that point? And how much time will it take you to carry out your role? So, for example, if your role is to go to the location where the person was supposed to be, how long will it take you to get there? And what do you do when you get there? You have to map all of that out, and you have to practice, have run-throughs to figure all that out. Have your strike team prepared, train, ready to respond. If you decide to do that, training practice for using security protocols through daily practices. What are the daily practices? Like your living situation. Now, because of the work I do, there are tons of people out here who make me their favorite person. Like they love to make threats. I did a workshop here 3 weeks ago that was standing room only. There were about 150 people in there, and there were fascists in there. And the reason why I know there were fascists in there is the organizers said that they got on their whatever thread they used to communicate, and they talked about attending the workshop and how they were going to do this and do that. And so that's the reality of the work that we do, right? I know that. I've known that forever. I would really at this stage in my life be disappointed if that never happened, because there's an old African saying that if the enemy isn't doing anything against you, it's because you're not doing anything. So I kind of like worry if I go too long without some of that stuff. So, but I have protocols in place. I have them with all the people I work with. I have them with my wife. I have them with my daughter. Everybody knows what to do if something doesn't happen the way it's supposed to happen, right? So you can have that with your family. They know what to do. Like every time I go, I'll come up to the caucus, I'll be there, and God willing, and when I get there, like my wife and daughter, they're in two different cities. They have the protocols in place. Like if they didn't hear from me for some reason, they know exactly what to do. You'd have more Africans in Oregon than you ever thought you'd ever see, and they know how to make that happen. So have your own protocols, if something like that happens. Your vehicles, like I regularly check my vehicle. I have a garage in my house, thankfully, but when I park outside, I always have a basic check I do on my vehicle. I check to make sure my brake lines are not cut. I check to make sure there's nothing else funny that could cause problems. It takes me not even 5 minutes, but I look at it like this. If something were to happen, that's a 5 minutes well spent. You have to decide how you feel about this. I know people have a lot of different beliefs, but if you are a person that believes that self-defense is warranted, I'm not telling you whether you should believe that or not, but if you are someone that does believe that, you have to practice that, like how you would respond. And there are some things that are not about you engaging in any violence against someone that are self-defense. They have to do with how do you approach your car at night in the dark? What kind of practices you need to engage in to make sure you're as safe and mitigating of any potential risk as possible. And these are things we can talk about in more detail. This is normally an hour thing. I'm doing it a lot shorter. So I don't have time to go into detail on everything, but if you want to know more, I'm always available to talk about this stuff. And then again, practicing the components of your plan collectively so that people know it. There's an old movement saying, get there early, or rather, the more you sweat now, the less you'll bleed later. So everything we do, like we're planning a pro immigration march here in 2 weeks. And, the fascists here are very active. We've had a number of encounters with them. Proud Boys, we've had a number of encounters with them. Unfortunately, the 3 times that they showed up, a number of them ended up in the hospital. And you can take that and do with it whatever you will. I'm just reporting to you what happened. But we anticipate some of that in 2 weeks here. So because of that, because they when they come, if you're familiar with them, they just attack, right? They're not people that are going to argue with you and debate. They just physically attack. And that's why we had to defend ourselves. And that's why they ended up in that situation. We're not trying to be aggressive. We're just trying to keep people safe. But you have to practice the components of your plan. And so the sweat now, so you don't bleed later. Like yesterday, we had a planning meeting for the march, and it was in a very rural area here, like 2 hours from where I live. And so I got there an hour early, and the people there were making fun of me. But I told them that's always my practice. I always get there early. I always get there to scope out what's going on. I always do that, and it has saved my life doing that. So I will continue to do that. I want to be there and see what's going on before the people that want to do harm get there to see what's going on. So, just to finalize, developing your plan and its components, identifying the tools needed to carry out your plan, practicing the components of the plan to ensure everyone knows their roles and is comfortable in carrying them out, practicing every element of your plan from communication to utilizing tools, self-defense moves, to every detail being known and mastered by everyone in your circles. And if you're interested, that's a book where I go into great more detail about that, but I'll just stop there. I hope that is useful. And again, if you want to know more, you can always know more.